Yo, gotta unmute that thing. How's it going, producers? It's Matt from Music Producer School. We made it to the weekend, and that's always exciting. Hope y'all are doing well. Let me throw my comments up here. Just to be sure, today is Saturday, so I'm going to be going over to the Music Producer School community right after this class today, and I'm going to be listening to your tracks. So be sure to join the Music Producer School community if you haven't already. We've got quite a few members over there. It's free, but it is a private community, so you have to join it, and I have to approve you first. So, excuse me, if you'd like to be able to submit your tracks and I listen to them live and I'll give you feedback on your tracks live, it's been pretty fun. I enjoy listening to you guys and girls, your music, and we've all, what's up, Ioane? We've all, I think, been learning some stuff from it. So be sure to join the Music Producer School community. Also, if you're looking for us on all the other social platforms, you can find us at that Linktree link, which has all of our other YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, all that stuff. So if you're looking for us in other places, that's the place to go. Finally, I wanted to especially stress today. So today we're going to be doing home recording part 3. And what I would like to do, especially today, is to get some of your questions, if possible. What are the things that you are having difficulty with? What are the things you are trying to achieve in your studio? Do you have questions about equipment, software, plugins, any types of questions that you may have? Feel free to go ahead and put them in the comments right now, and I'm going to try and do more of like an answering question session if we have some questions. And also, don't forget, I put the Chat with Matt link in the Facebook comments there. You can actually use that link and call me live right now. And if you want to talk and chat, ask me a question, a comment, whatever you want. It's pretty cool. We've done it a couple times so far, and it's been pretty sweet. So if you'd like to ask me a question directly that way, don't be shy. Click the link. You can be on your phone and do it. You can be on your computer, your tablet. You don't need any special software. Just click that link. Allow the software to use your camera and your microphone so we can chat. And it's that simple. I'll put you in the call and we can talk to each other. So once again, if you have any types of questions about specific stuff you're trying to do for your own productions, your own recording, feel free to ask me those questions, because today would be a great day to do that. So we're going to get started now with home recording part 3. And I'm going to bring up Ableton here. But the main thing that I wanted to kind of go over today was, in any DAW, you know, a lot of people, when they're mixing and mastering and we're doing all this stuff to get our songs, you know, perfect, right? A lot of people think that it's all about EQ, compression, and it is, but I guess actually we may start not in Ableton today. Let me pull up something for you guys. So I think this is a concept that a lot of people these days, they don't really fully understand. And it's something that, because I was fortunate enough when I started recording back in the day, I was still, well, I guess I should say I'm old enough to where I actually was working on analog consoles. And that's something that not a lot of us get to do anymore. I mean, I haven't worked on an analog console in a studio in forever. But there's some key principles about analog consoles that a lot of people don't quite understand. And let me pull up a SSL mixer, because this is one of the most popular analog consoles. Let me find a good channel strip here to take a look at. So, I mean, something like this, you know, we've all seen this photo before of the nice big analog mixer, right? And what a lot of people don't realize, especially in the digital recording age that we live in, is there's a reason why, and if you've never worked on an analog console, you may not be aware of this, but there's a reason why when you actually mix on an analog console, it's actually a little bit easier in a lot of ways because you almost instantly get this nice separation between your instruments and your channels. You also will find on an analog console, if you just bump the treble on your EQ a little bit, you can really, really hear it. And what a lot of people don't understand, or they just never learned because they only started out in a computer, is when you get down into the why of why these things sound better almost initially. What you need to understand is, let me pull this one up for example. So this is a smaller version of an SSL mixer, but what you can see is you have your individual channel strips right here, right? So you have your fader, you have, your pan, your EQ, all the stuff that we're used to. But what a lot of people don't realize is that within each of these channels, and let me see if I can pull up my whiteboard here to give you a better representation. Give me 1 second here. I want to actually give you guys a visual representation of what I'm talking about. I think it'll be a little bit easier to understand. So let me save this really quickly, because a lot of people, like I said, I had to kind of dig to find this stuff out because I didn't get to work on analog consoles a whole bunch, but I was able to work on them enough to understand how this works, because it is easier to get a good mix going on an analog console initially. Now, analog consoles are great for that. They sound great, but the problem you're going to run into analog stuff is you don't have a lot of good recall, meaning if you want to just change one little thing, unless you have a super expensive analog console with all kinds of automation and stuff on it, it's going to be almost impossible to recall your mixes, and then recalling your mixes quickly is just completely out of the question. So quick story, when I was working at my first studio, we actually had sheets of paper where you had like your reverbs were separate, outboard reverbs. We had the mixer was an analog. It was a digital and analog mixer, but the recall wasn't super great on it. So you would actually, on a sheet of paper for each client, you would have to write down the settings of your compressors, your reverbs, all this stuff. It was kind of crazy thinking back on it that everybody used to have to do that, but that's what you used to have to do. So the thing is, what I was saying is a lot of people don't realize with these analog consoles, you have essentially these separate channel strips that are going to act almost as individual, almost like individual distortion units. So this is your channel strip right here. This is what I was trying to get to with this photo. So this is your channel strip, right? So you have your fader right here. You have your pan. You have some effects you can do here. And then you can patch in, like EQs. And on a regular analog mixer, you'd have your EQs and stuff like that as well. Now, this is the trick. What a lot of people don't realize is because these strips are all separate, completely pieces of hardware, it's just they're all built together like this, but they're all actually separate strips of electronics. So what happens is your sounds, let's say you had your kick here, your snare here, your tom 1 here, tom 2, and then your overheads were on this pair of channels, right? For your drums, let's say. Well, that means your kick is going through a whole separate piece of circuitry. The snare is going through separate circuitry. All of these are going through separate circuits. Then they're being mixed together. So what happens when you do that is there's these little bits of distortion, and just because in electronics you can't exactly replicate like you do in a computer, On a computer DAW, every channel is literally exactly the same. It's all programmed zeros and ones, and they all sound exactly the same. Whereas on an analog console like this, each channel, even though they make them exactly the same, because it's electrical signals and it's actual physical pieces of material, they all have a slightly different sound to them. So literally by just putting your tracks into an analog console like this, you're going to get a little bit better separation because there's these little tiny, almost you can't really hear them necessarily, but these little bits of distortion that get added to each track on each channel, and that kind of adds to this separation. So there's actually a company I was going to show you guys. I don't use this myself. I've actually never tried it yet, but I'm very interested in trying it. It's called Harrison Mixbus. And basically, the Harrison Mixbus is one of these deals where they basically finally, after a while, they realized, oh, wait, that's why it's so much easier to get a good, quick mix going in an analog console, because each channel sounds just a little bit different. And we're going to expand on that as well today, talking a little more about distortion. But what they actually did with this thing called Harrison Mixbus is they actually programmed the channels in the digital computer to each have a little bit different character to them. Not anything drastic, but so that when you start mixing in it, it's immediately going to sound better. And that's super key if you think about it and the repercussions of that, because again, we're so used to mixing in FL Studio, Pro Tools, Ableton, Logic. All of these channels are exactly the same. So now that I've kind of explained that stuff to you, let's now switch over to Ableton, and I want to kind of give you some examples of how you can apply this to your own mixes. And the reason I included this in the home recording section this week was because there's a lot of people out there that you record your stuff, you know, you get excited about your new song, and you start mixing, and if you're watching some of my previous lessons, you know, I'm big on using reference tracks. Well, you may be mixing your song for a day or two. You're like, yeah, it sounds really great. But then you put up your reference track of the latest, whatever it may be, Bruno Mars, Kanye, some pop rock stuff, some pop stuff, some EDM stuff, whatever it is you're trying to make. And you're like, whoa, their mix sounds so much more separated. I can hear the individual instruments better. It sounds bigger. It sounds wider. Why is that? So today, I'm going to show you how to remedy some of that stuff. What's up, Manuel? I'm going to show you how to remedy some of that stuff by introducing some distortion on your channels. So let's say here I had a kick drum. I have my snare. I have my tom 1, my tom 2. And then, like I said, let's do a pair of overheads, let's call it, right? And y'all know that I like my drums in yellow. I'm not really going to worry about doing any actual beats today, but just so that we have a little bit of audio on here to look at, I will throw something on here for you guys just to visually look at. Okay, so we got that. Let's see if we can find a tom. All right, this will work. This will work. And I don't know. Okay, I do have an overhead. Cool. All right, so this is what our tracks would look like right now, right? Now, again, I'm going to try and give you an example of how I do this. You don't have to do it the same way that I do it, but just to give you some ideas. So what a lot of people would do for this, they would take their drums, and, you know, especially if you're first starting out, they put a limiter, maybe they put a compressor on their master channel, okay? And all of these drums, they start mixing, you know, getting your levels right, mess with my levels, do a little bit of panning, you know, whatever. Okay, so you do that, and then you have, let's say, you know, like 30 tracks in an actual song. So all of your tracks, and it may be helpful to kind of look at it like this for some of you guys. You have your mixer here, right? Cool. Well, that's all well and good. But when you start mixing directly into your master here in the glue compressor I'm using and the limiter, again, when you pull up your reference tracks, you're going to be like, wait, this doesn't sound as good as the stuff I'm hearing on the radio. What's going on? So again, it's these little bits of distortion along the way. And especially if you're looking for loudness in your mixes and your masters, this is super key. So let me show you what you got to do. The first thing that I would do is I would take all of my drums and I would group them. And I'm going to call it drum group or drum, I usually call it drum bus. So what I would do here is I would put probably a compressor here, and then I like to use the Ableton Saturator. And I turn this soft clip on, which means it's not going to let any of those transients that go over 0, it's not going to let those go through beyond this bus. So that way when you're mixing all of your tracks together, you don't have all this clipping happening all over the place. So what have we done? We're mixing just our drums here. We're going into the drum bus. We're putting a little bit of compression on to just kind of glue everything together a little bit, hence the name, the glue compressor. And then I can also turn my soft clip there as well, but I'm just going to use it on this. So now on this saturator, what a lot of people I find they get confused with distortion is they throw a distortion plug-in on something and they're like, oh, well, I'm hearing distorted stuff. That's not good. I need to take it off. But what they don't realize is when you add distortion like this for more what I call musical distortion, you've got two types of distortion. You've got musical distortion and you've got clipping. We don't want clipping because that's going past 0 and that just always sounds bad for the most part. Musical distortion is when we're going to add, I'm talking maybe just a couple dB of saturation or distortion here, right? So I just added 2 dB of drive here on the saturator. Now, you also, in this Ableton Saturator, and this is the same for FL Studio and all these other plugins that you're going to use, you have these different presets or options that you can use where you can see right now, this is called analog clipping. So it's more of like a smoother kind of a curve, so it's not going to be as harsh. You also have a soft sine, it's a little bit harder, a medium curve, hard curve, all the way down to these other different types, okay? So you can put just a little bit of distortion on, and then just right here, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, you have 7 different types of distortion you can use, and this is just with the built-in saturation plugin, okay? So what I would probably do is like an analog clip for this. Now you also have these frequencies that you can set, which also kind of tells you what frequencies it's really going to be acting on. So in other words, I would put this on my drum bus, but then I may also put another saturator on my kick, okay, just on my kick drum, and then I might, because the kick, we want to have a little bit, it's okay if it actually has a little bit of a click, a little bit of a pop to it. So maybe for that, we would use something a little harder, like the hard curve, or maybe even the digital clip. Because again, it's okay on a kick drum if we have a little pop. So I would maybe do, you know, just like 1 dB, or I could do, since I changed the type of distortion, I could stick with my around 2 dB, but then I can move my dry wet here to where I'm only introducing a little bit. And that's the thing with the distortion stuff that I think trips a lot of people up at first is they basically put a distortion plugin on, and because most distortion plugins are kind of set to where you're really going to hear a lot of distortion at first, they're like, whoa, that sounds terrible. You need to dial these back just to where they're just barely audible, sometimes not even audible. But as you start stacking these, those little bits of distortion that you add are going to start adding these pleasing frequencies to each one of your sounds. And if you use different distortion plugins on each track, you're gonna get this, start introducing that separation that I was showing you like on that SSL console. So continuing with this example, we may put that on the kick. Now for the snare, let's for the snare actually use Ableton has actually a distortion plugin. It has one called Dynamic Tube, and it has Overdrive. So we could throw the Dynamic Tube on here. And again, when you first put this drive on, because it's 100% dry wet, it's going to sound maybe a little funky, but you just got to back it off to where it's just giving it a little bit of an extra. That's the other thing with distortion as well. You know, back in the day when people were first recording, you had real guitars, real amplifiers, tube microphones. All of these pieces would add, again, these little bits of distortion that when you would get the final record done, all these instruments sounded very, very clear. They each owned kind of their own little space in the mix. And that's something that we lost when we went into digital workstations like this, because every channel is programmed to sound exactly the same. So it's up to us now to introduce these little bits of distortion. Let's see. Yoani said we use Juice Loop and GarageBand. Yeah. So you can do this in any of the programs, and I've heard of Juice Loop, and the key is you know, trying to use different distortion plugins so that you can get these different kind of sounds like you get on the analog consoles. So again, on the snare, I might use the Dynamic Tube. You have this different tone control. You have these different tube modes. So again, I had showed you guys before, I have a whole section dedicated in my plugins to distortion. So I've got Ableton Amp, Dynamic Tube, Overdrive, Saturator, Vinyl Distortion. This is another one I wanted to show you guys. It's called Amplitube, which this is a guitar plugin. So for example, there's some free guitar simulation plugins, and this is super, super killer for keyboards. If you're using a plug-in keyboard synth sound inside of the computer and you want it to stand out, you want it to sound a little more analog, let me show you a trick for that. So let's say I have, y'all know that I like Sylenth just because I'm pretty quick with it. If I throw Sylenth up here and I wanted to make this sound a little bit more analog, what I could do is actually create a return track. And I'm going to call this my Synth Distortion. Or let's just call it Synth Return for right now so we can see it. There we go. Synth Distortion. So what you could do here, and you don't need to use Amplitube. This is just one that I happen to like the sound of a lot. But if I take Amplitube here and I throw it on this return bus, this return channel, it's going to pull it up. And we don't necessarily want to use the cabinet on this thing. And actually, this is my, I believe this is my older version of Amplitube. Let me see. I think I have Amplitube 4, which is the newer version. It's a little bit upgraded and sounds a little bit better. So this is Amplitube 4. So I can pick all these different types of amplifiers that I can now, I've got EQ on this stuff, volume, probably wouldn't do the reverb in here, but I can then go into, I have these racks available where I can use different types of rack type effects like filters, modulations. This one's cool because it has a rotary speaker, so if we have any organ players out there, you can use the rotary speaker in here. Sounds pretty cool. But then also I have these cabinet things that I can use here where I can actually turn on and off the different cabinet simulations. So you have all this control where you can actually change all of these different things. And what happens is when you play your VST synth, just like you would do a reverb, you start to send a little bit of it into this distortion here. And again, this is super cool to do it like this because you can just kind of mix as much as you need. And another little trick on this is, let's say if you are, using a synth as a lead, especially on lead synthesizer like melody stuff. What you can do is maybe you're using it throughout the track, but then when it's say on an EDM song, a drop comes, or if you really need the melody to stand out, you can automate your send right here to actually, you don't have to increase the distortion, but what you can do is send more of your synth into this distortion. So that's another way you can do it. Now, something else you might be able to do is instead of putting it on a return track like that, let me get rid of that. We can also use some of these. This is, I believe, a free one that I like to use called Camel Crusher. So on our track itself, after the VST synth, we could put Camel Crusher on there. And again, you have this mix control where, let's say, your melody drop, or you need it to stand out here. I can bump that mix control up with my automation here, and even just on certain notes, if you need something to pop through really nice, you can just automate certain notes. And what happens is you're not necessarily just like a normal volume automation where everything's just going to get super loud all of a sudden. It's just going to distort these certain frequencies that are going to let it poke through your mix without really getting much louder. And that's how you can also get your mixes and masters louder, because a lot of people think, oh, well, let me just automate the volume up and down, which that will work. But when you automate your volume up and down, as the volume of the whole synth goes up, now your master limiter is going to see that whole volume across the frequencies, and it's going to start pushing down on everything. So even though your synth may be in like the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 hertz range, when the limiter sees that whole synthesizer going up, it's going to start pushing down on everything. So your vocals are going to suffer, your drums are going to suffer, everything. So this way you can just distort the important parts, make them poke through. And this is also a great tip to use for vocals as well. Again, I would highly suggest you start, if you haven't yet, start experimenting with putting distortion on your sounds, backing off the wet dry knobs just a little bit as you go. So again, on the drum example, we have a little bit on the kick, just a couple dB. Then it goes into the drum bus. We would have maybe another 1, 2 dB here. Then as it goes into the master, I like to use the UAD, it's called UAD Oxide Tape plugin. So this is another very slight tape distortion plugin that, again, it's not something that you're going to hear like a guitar distortion, but as you start stacking these little bits of distortion, you're going to start getting those extra 1, 2, 3, up to 5, maybe 6 dB of volume. And now you're going to start being able, before you even hit the limiter, or a lot of times before you even hit your compressor, all these little bits of distortion are going to start to clarify each instrument that you use them on. And you're also going to start building up those frequencies, so that way when you compare it to your favorite reference tracks, you're not going to be so much lower than the reference tracks. So by the time you do get to your compressor and your limiter, you're not having to add, 8 dB, 10 dB with your limiter, which of course is going to squash your track. So I'm gonna keep it there for you guys today. That's a lot to kind of think on. The other tip I wanted to tell y'all to do is start listening, especially with headphones, because it's hard to hear on studio monitors. But if you start listening to some of your favorite songs and tracks on headphones, start to listen for the distortion on things like vocals. Once you kind of tune your ear to it, you'll be able to hear it all over the place. But I remember when I was starting out, I kind of heard this advice of like, oh, you got to learn how to use distortion properly, because that's what the big guys are using to get nice, loud, separated mixes and masters. And I just I don't know if I ignored it or my ear just wasn't good enough yet. But now, especially on like older songs from the 60s, the 70s, you can hear distortion all over the place. I mean, the guitars, of course, but the bass, the drums, the vocals, especially. Listen for distortion on vocals in some of your favorite records, and you're going to start hearing how these guys are achieving these mixes that sound so big and powerful. So, okay, you guys, I'm going to wrap it up for today. I'm going to head on over to the Music Producer School community. Once again, if you haven't joined, click the comment in the Facebook comments. Join the Music Producer School community. I'll approve you before I fire it up over there in just a few minutes. I believe we have some tracks over there already to listen to, but if you'd like for me to listen to one of your tracks, go post it over there as a YouTube link, SoundCloud, any type of streaming thing will do. And I'm going to go over there in about 5 minutes, and I'm going to be listening to some tracks, giving some live feedback. I hope this stuff was helpful today. If I don't see you over in the community, have a great weekend, and go listen to some of those tracks and start listening for that distortion. All right, I'll see y'all in a little bit in the Music Producer School community. Thanks for joining me today. Peace.